On the 25th of November, it was announced that Simon Schuster would be merged with Penguin Random House after being bought for nearly $2.2 billion by Bertelsmann, the German media conglomerate that owns Penguin Random House. How did we get to this point? And is this bad for the industry, for readers and authors? This merger is part of a trend that began around 50 years ago. I recently read The Business of Books by André Schiffrin, an author and publisher who worked for many years, many decades in fact, in the industry. The book is a kind of memoir which traces the history of publishing in the 20th century through the experience of the author and the people he has known and worked with. In the early 20th century, there were many more publishers than there are today. Lots of them still exist, but in name only. For example, Viking Press was founded in 1925, and the name is attached to 2 of this week's 10 best-selling books in the UK. However, since 1975, it has belonged to Penguin, now part of Penguin Random House. In fact, looking at the publishers of this week's top 10 best-selling books in the UK, there appears at first glance to be a diversity of publishers. Just some of the names on the list are Viking, Ebury, Puffin, Bantam, and Chatto and Windhouse. But all 5 that I just mentioned are part of Penguin Random House. 10 years ago, we talked about the big 6 in publishing. In 2012, 2 of these, Penguin and Random House, merged, leaving us with the big 5. And if this merger goes ahead, we will be left with the big 4. In 2015, it was estimated that the big 5 held about 80% of the US trade market. That is, the kind of books bought by a general audience, not necessarily including textbooks and so on. Of this, Penguin Random House was the largest with 37%, and Simon & Schuster was around 12%. This suggests that the new mega merged publisher will control about half of the US trade market. The Bertelsmann CEO argues that it will be under 20% of the US market. Presumably he's looking at the book market as a whole rather than just the trade sector. Personally, I find it counterproductive that in a time when publishing is reckoning with its lack of diversity, more and more of the industry is being put under one roof. For publishing to reach and serve as broad an audience as possible, it needs diversity. Diversity of staff, diversity of ideas, and diversity of approaches. This is stifled when more and more editors are ultimately working under the same boss, as part of the same corporate structure, with the same shareholders. The problems go deeper than that though, especially considering the nature of today's owners of these huge publishers. Schiffrin spent most of his career at Pantheon, a once independent publisher that had become part of Random House before he started working there. Even under the umbrella of that much larger publisher though, he describes having the relative freedom to pursue a model of publishing that he believed in, bringing in a diversity of sometimes difficult but always worthwhile books to market. Publishing a few bigger sellers that compensated for less financially successful books, and making a modest but steady profit of about 3% per year. That started to change around the 1980s, when publishers began to be bought up by large media conglomerates that were also beginning to dominate in the television and newspaper sectors. In his book, Schiffrin talks about how the new media conglomerates were used to making much larger profits in film, TV and newspapers. Ironic given the state of the newspaper industry today, and I wonder what role the business model of these conglomerates has played in bringing about the gradual demise of the newspaper. Nowadays, at the large publishers, every book must make money. When they demand profits of 10% and more, rather than the old 3%, every book must be a bestseller. There is less room to take risks. Decisions are made under the guidance of finance above all other considerations. This model doesn't work. It also comes with other risks. Schiffrin writes, generally, it is safe to say that whenever a conglomerate has a wide variety of holdings, there is a very real risk that its media companies will not report news that might diminish the profitability of other branches of the firm. In France, for instance, the Hachette Group has long been part of a large corporation that also owns much of the French armament industry. To my knowledge, no major critiques of the arms trade have been published by Hachette, nor are there likely to be. He also describes how Basic Books, then owned by HarperCollins, which is part of Rupert Murdoch's media empire, published once a book by the daughter of China's former leader, Deng Xiaoping. This came with a reportedly very expensive publicity campaign to promote the book, despite the book itself being a dud. Coincidentally, at the time, Murdoch was trying to get permission to run a censored version of his TV network in China. Schiffrin draws comparison to Murdoch promising Margaret Thatcher support from his newspapers in the 80s in exchange for not applying anti-monopoly laws to prevent his purchase of several British newspapers. Some are hoping that this merger will be blocked by regulators. The US Authors Guild and Andrew Franklin of British independent publisher Profile Books have both called for governments to intervene and block the merger on competition grounds, fearing the lurch towards the monopolisation of the publishing industry. News Corp Chief Executive Robert Thomson said of the merger that there is clearly no market logic to a bid of that size, only anti-market logic. Bertelsmann is not just buying a book publisher, but buying market dominance as a book behemoth. Distributors, retailers, authors, and readers would be paying for this proposed deal for a very long time to come. This literary leviathan would have 70% of the US literary and general fiction market. There will certainly be legal books written about this deal, though I wonder if Bertelsmann would publish them. You might perhaps take this with a pinch of salt, however, as News Corp, owner of HarperCollins, one of the other big four publishers, was the other conglomerate bidding to buy Simon Schuster. Not everyone agrees. Michael Baskar, an author and co-founder of the independent publisher Canelo, tweeted that this will create more room and oxygen in the gaps for fast-growing companies. Points of difference become starker. Places like Canelo can play a different game while the giants slug it out. Journalist and author Franklin Foer, who is himself published by Penguin Random House, has written an article about the merger for The Atlantic. He talks about the dangers of this kind of conglomeration, saying that it hurts authors by driving advances down and that bigger businesses lose their sense of purpose, drawing comparison to Hollywood's move towards sequels and big franchises, and points out that a giant corporation starts to worry about the prospect of regulators messing with its well-being, a condition that tends to induce political caution in deciding which writers to publish. However, his article is called "The Monster Publishing Merger is About Amazon." He argues that the core of the problem is that Amazon controls too much of the book market, as well as other parts of retail. He suggests that it would be a mistake for governments to block this move, which is aimed at redressing this power imbalance by consolidating the power on the side of the publishers without doing more about Amazon and its own monopoly. Let me briefly talk about the retail end of the stick then, which is where most of my own work experience in books has been so far. The way we get our books has been changing alongside the changes in how books are published. Since the Thatcher-Reagan era inaugurated decades of cuts to public service funding, especially cultural funding, the number of public libraries has been in decline in the UK and the US, and those that remain have less money for books and staff than they once did. In fact, Schiffrin talks about this in terms of the loss of sales of certain types of books that might not have sold many copies through bookshops, but would once have found an audience and a market through libraries. Physical bookshops have been decimated over the past several years. Huge numbers of independents and even many medium-sized chains have shuttered. And while large chains such as Waterstones in the UK and Barnes & Noble in the US have in many cases replaced them, there are many streets and neighbourhoods whose bookshop closed and was never replaced, not even by a large chain. Big cities like New York and London have gone from having hundreds of bookshops a few decades ago to dozens now. And many smaller places have gone from having one or two to having none at all. This means there are fewer booksellers to ask for recommendations, and fewer shop windows and table displays in bookshops and libraries where a book that could change your life might catch your eye. And while many booksellers at the chains like Waterstones are very knowledgeable and talented booksellers who go a long way to bring their own judgment, personality and taste to their branches, there will always be more uniformity in a chain than in hundreds of independents. The emphasis on Waterstones' Books of the Month, promoted heavily across all its branches, is just one example of this. Likewise, if everyone is going on Amazon for their books, they're going to see what books Amazon are putting on the front page. And algorithms cannot compensate for this loss of diversity of mind. Mark Fisher, in his book Capitalist Realism, makes a point that could apply both to focus group driven acquisition decisions at publishers and to Amazon's algorithmic recommendation engines that offer you books you might like based on what you or people like you previously enjoyed. He writes, "The reason that focus groups and capitalist feedback systems fail even when they generate commodities that are immensely popular is that people do not know what they want. This is not only because people's desire is already present but concealed from them, although this is often the case. Rather, the most powerful forms of desire are precisely cravings for the strange, the unexpected, the weird. These can only be supplied by artists and media professionals who are prepared to give people something different from that which already satisfies them. By those, that is to say, prepared to take a certain kind of risk." Overall, while I am not happy about the merger, to me it is more a symptom of bigger problems than something to worry too much about in isolation. In 1997, anthropologist Marilyn Strathern pointed out that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. Profitability may well be a worthwhile measure in the book trade. If nobody at all buys a book, perhaps it wasn't worth the effort of publishing. But under capitalism, especially when regulations are absent or unenforced, the measure of profit inevitably becomes the primary target of all businesses as they grow. The structure of book publishing, book retail, and the broader media sector are driven by a motivation that strangles all other purposes. This merger is just another step on a path we've been on for a while, and which we will keep following until there are fundamental changes to the structural conditions that give rise to it. What do you think? Leave a comment and let me know. I would like to take part in more critical conversations around the publishing industry and wider book world, so if you would like to keep up with my future videos, why not subscribe to my channel? And if you're interested in reading more, I do recommend both The Business of Books by André Schiffrin and Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism. Why not check them out, see if you can rent them from your local library or buy them from your local independent bookshop. Or if you'd like to support me, I'll put a link to them on my own online bookshop in the description. And as always, thank you for watching.